This episode is sponsored by Grow Therapy. Grow Therapy was founded on the belief that quality mental health care should be accessible. It makes finding an in-network therapist easy. Go to growtherapy.com to find your match and let insurance pay for your therapy.
Welcome to a place where you'll leave feeling whole. The Counseling Podcast brings at-home counseling right to you, focusing on self-care, self-expression, and breaking down barriers. Dr. Jaclyn and Dr. Stokes bring over 20 years of combined experience and a new sense of style to the word counseling. The two use humor and lighthearted conversation to explore these deeper feelings. Let's take the stigma away from counseling together.
Hello, listeners, and welcome back to the Counseling Podcast. I am Dr. Jaclyn.
And I'm Dr. Stokes.
And today we want to talk about sex. This is always an exciting and fun topic, but when it comes to relationships, sex can be both negative and positive. The intimate part of relationships do not just have to focus on sex, as it can also be the emotional part of the relationship. So we wanted to just share professional and personal perspectives from a male and female view. Let's have fun with this topic. So sex and intimacy, I see from a professional standpoint of issues being like trust issues that can definitely break the emotional connection. Therefore, you can then have a lack of intimacy in your relationship. Do you agree, Dr. Stokes?
Absolutely. I think trust is a really big piece when it comes to relationships. And I think, too, when we think of sex or sexuality even, that's really a part of a person's identity as well. I mean, we think about sexual orientation, we think about attraction, we think about how that all fits into the framework of a relationship. And so this is, I think I've come to find in my practice that this is a really big part of people's lives that goes all the way back, right, since the beginning of time. I mean, we are creatures who crave intimacy, and then we have the whole biological functionality of sex in and of itself. So it's a big part of the lives of our clients, Dr. Jaclyn, absolutely.
Yeah, and sex, I mean, when it comes to sex and intimacy, you need to be able to feel vulnerable. But if you don't have like the security and stability and the trust, then you're not going to, be willing to feel that vulnerability with your partner and become more intimate and open with your partner.
Absolutely. I think vulnerability is such a important piece. And, I try to work with clients, and whether I'm working with individuals or couples, and I know you do a lot of work with couples, vulnerability, I think, is a cornerstone. How do we first of all help people become more vulnerable, and then how do we help their partners receive that vulnerability? Because I think that, as you're alluding to, I think that if that's not there, then that trust piece can't be there, and then the intimacy can't be there. There's this great model of looking at couples, and we describe it kind of like having four walls of a house. So one wall is trust, one wall is communication, one wall is mutual respect, and then the other wall is intimacy. And I think all of those walls sort of work together to build the house of the relationship. And if there's pieces missing in any of those walls, it's hard for the infrastructure of the relationship to stand.
Absolutely. I think that builds a very strong foundation for the couple if you kind of have all of those in place. And I wanted to kind of touch on, when I see couples in, the counseling office, it tends to be the woman needs to feel the emotional connection, and then the man is normally the one who says, I'm not feeling enough physical connection. So they both want to be connected, but the man's like, I want to have sex or intimacy or touch you or feel you or all those things to feel connected. And the woman's like, well, I can't do that if I don't feel emotionally connected. Do you kind of see the same?
Absolutely. 100%, and it's kind of a stereotype, but it's kind of true. It is really true, and the thing is that it can create either this really great cycle or it can create this really vicious cycle, right? Because if the woman is not feeling that sense of emotional connection and that vulnerability in her partner, she'll often draw away, and then the man will feel neglected and he'll feel sexually abandoned, and then that creates resentment in his heart, and then he takes it out on her, and it creates this really dysfunctional cycle. And so I try to work oftentimes I think a lot of men, quote unquote, their love language can be physical affection and touch. So I try to work though with men and women and, hey, where is this cycle breaking up? Where is the disconnect? And oftentimes, I hate to say it, but oftentimes the men they're not really exhibiting that emotional piece a lot of times. That can be the first step. I'll work with men at helping them understand their own emotional processes and give them kind of some practical steps to be more vulnerable with their partner. I think in our culture, men are taught to not be vulnerable. And I think that ends up, unfortunately, presenting itself in their intimate relationships.
Exactly, yes. But isn't sex for man very vulnerable? Or how do you feel that men, isn't that a vulnerable state right there? So you're opening yourself up to your partner of letting them know, like, this is the part of me that I want to be with you, but I have to have that other part. So how can we tell our partners that we want this without sounding selfish or like, oh, my partner only wants what they want and they're not listening to my needs?
Yeah, great question. I think that's that whole communication piece. I think the communication piece is what facilitates the brokenness in that structure, right? And I think that it requires both individuals to be able to sit down and be open and transparent and talk about it, right? Like, I think it's as much as it's the man's responsibility, I think it's the woman's responsibility to be able to come to the man and say, hey, look, this is what I need. This is what I need from you. This is what I'm not receiving from you. Equally, I think the man needs to be able to come to the woman and say, hey, look, I want to connect with you in this way. What do we have to do in order to facilitate this? Because I think a lot of times when some of that brokenness is in the relationship, people unfortunately draw further and further away from each other instead of pressing in. That's why I try to tell my couples, press in. When there's conflict, press in, lean into one another. But obviously our defenses get in the way and we don't want to do that. We want to be right. That's that old saying, do you want to be happy or do you want to be right? Yes. So I do see that. But yeah, I think to your question, I think being able to create that vulnerability in the therapy session, they can then model that outside in their personal lives.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, a lot of couples tend to compare. So they're like, well, my friends are having sex or being intimate this many times a week. So what's wrong with us? And I've read so many times, and I try to tell clients that, listen, whatever is good for your relationship is good. If you're content with just say once a week having, that intimacy, it doesn't even have to be the sex itself, but just to hold each other and connect. That's fine if that's what works for you guys. It doesn't have to be an everyday thing. But now with the world getting so busy, it's like, do we make enough time? Are we having enough time to spend quality time with our partner, whether it's just connecting or emotional or talking? And that's going to help build you to get you to, if we're cutting out, I won't do so many emails tonight, I'm going to spend time with my partner. And then you kind of make it a consistent, well, every night we're going to have this many minutes together, and then it will lead to bigger things and to more connection.
Absolutely. I mean, there's so much to unpack there. I think that people often do struggle with like the first part of what you're saying, different couples with different frequency. And what that makes me think about is there's so many variables as to why people don't have the quality of sex and the relationship that they need, the quality of intimacy. I mean, doing kind of like an informal sexual assessment, I mean, there could be erectile dysfunction issues for the man. There could be sexual related issues for the woman. There could be sexual trauma history for the man and or the woman. And by the way, we're talking, so listeners know, we're speaking man and woman. This can be for, couples, man, woman, woman as well. We're just kind of, we're doing a framework here. But there's all these variables. There's busyness, as you mentioned, that get in the way of the intimacy. And I think that's a big thing, is that people don't talk about it with their partners. I know that if, for example, I've worked with men and the men have trouble performing and they're not able to really talk to their partner about what's going on physically for them or psychologically for them. And so these are the things that we have to really consider. I mean, there's so much that goes into this, but I really like your point about how do we work towards getting people to be just more intimately close, not necessarily sexually, but more intimately close to help facilitate that sexual dynamic.
Of course. And I'm really glad that you brought up and clarified that, not just man and woman, woman and woman, man and man, whether you have multiple partners, open relationships. This is obviously, we're talking about just couples in general and just partners. And the intimacy in relationships and what relationships go through. It's an everyday struggle to work on your relationship, and whatever the expectations you need from your partner, everyone's different. Maybe I want more communication, and maybe my partner wants more physical. And it's like, well, if we're both mutually respecting each other and I am giving you what you need and you're giving me what I need, then we're going to feel balanced.
Absolutely. And couples are so imbalanced. And I think that this imbalance is what leads to the real big dysfunction, right? So it may start out as, okay, my partner is not emotionally available and I want more sex, or whatever that initial issue is. But then over time, that begins to erode and that begins to build. And then we have some really major issues. And that's where things like infidelity come in. Or really deep-rooted resentment for partners, right? And then we're talking about some major brokenness. And I think as couples counselors, we want to be able, if we can, to be preventative and intervene, have people intervene before those major issues happen, with these more practical things of like, hey, let's talk about sex, right? So we don't so it doesn't lead to something more severe.
Of course. And normally when you step into a relationship, you're not thinking about those bigger issues. You're not thinking about if my partner was, like you said, had trauma in the past, or what triggers they may have, guy or girl, when it comes to those things. And it may come out later in the relationship. And then they may feel like, oh, my partner's pulling away from me. But really, your partner may just be struggling with something and they don't know how to share that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And going back to that vulnerability piece, if we don't know how to get close to our partner, how do we ever find these things out, right? And that's where both individuals have to do their own work, because we're all coming into relationships, as you know, Dr. Jaclyn, we're all coming in to relationships with our childhood issues, right? With things that we learned from our parents. Because and for the listeners, even if you had great parents and a great family situation, we all learned dysfunction and we all picked up bad habits. And so we bring that in. And some of us who had really dysfunctional childhoods, we definitely are bringing that into our intimate relationships. And so I think the individual themselves needs to have the humility to be able to say, hey, look, like, I've got some stuff in my life that I really need to work on. And in order for this relationship to be as optimal as possible, I'm going to have to do my work too.
Sure. And sometimes I like to make it fun for the couples and kind of say, okay, during the week, let's do some intimacy exercises. Maybe that's sitting down. Maybe one night it's, one person gets to choose what that looks like. And maybe they're doing more communicative exercises. And then maybe one night it's, let's explore our bodies together. Let's do, different games, or we can make it fun where they can be connected. Do you kind of do exercises like that with your couples?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think that that's so vital, when you get a couple come in for therapy to these, these just, how do we apply these different types of functions in our relationship? And so all kinds of exercises, all kinds of activities. And you do end up getting, even if you're not quote unquote a sex therapist, as a couples counselor, any good couples counselor, we are going to venture into that sexual intimacy world with our partner, with our clients. It's going to come up, right? And so I think that oftentimes it can be the first time that couples ever even talk about sex in our office. I mean, I've had couples come in they've never said a word to each other about their sex life until they get into my office. And I think that shows that there are a lot of people out there who just don't know. They just don't know how to communicate about this. So those exercises, Dr. Jaclyn, that you're mentioning, those things can help to facilitate innovative ways for them and creative ways for them to connect with each other.
Yeah, and I think it's so common to the communication piece. You either have couples that don't talk about it, or couples that's kind of their only argument is that I don't get enough sex. So it's almost like on both spectrums of I've had different couples that do not communicate, and then they do explore that, and then the other couples that are like, well, this is what I hear from them all the time, I'm not enough, or what they're projecting onto their partner.
Absolutely. I absolutely see that end of the spectrum as well, right? It's like, that's the main argument. I'm working with a couple right now. That's the main argument, is there's just not enough of that intimate connection. And that's a really big deal, right? Going back to that 4-wall house of the relationship, I mean, relationships will crumble if that's not there. And you know, as I mentioned earlier, that's where if it's not intervention done, that person will oftentimes reach outside of the marriage, unfortunately.
Yes, and there are ways that you can build with your partner. You really have to explore what you need from a relationship. And if people don't know that, then when they get more familiar with that, of being self-aware of what do I need from my partner to feel that security, and then to have me open up more.
Absolutely. And I think that, like, it's important for the listeners to know that, like, we, even as therapists, we will run into these kinds of struggles in our relationships. Like, we are human. We have our own human brokenness. We have the things that occur in our lives that, you know, prevent us from, you know, having our needs met or not expressing our needs. So these are things that all people need to work on. But I think it's being able to practice that vulnerability and being transparent is key. I think one of the things that the reason that we're not vulnerable, especially men, I'll speak to the men, you know, the reason that men are oftentimes afraid of being transparent in this department is they're afraid of being perceived as weak. They're afraid of being perceived as insufficient. They're afraid of being perceived like they can't handle things, like they can't take care of things. And so they'll oftentimes hold back, and then they'll internalize all of this stuff, and then this stuff will build up. And then, you know, there's some sort of combustion that happens, and the relationship will hit a bottom. And sometimes it can be exactly what the relationship needs. Like, sometimes I'll get clients who come in who, you know, they'll hit what I call a relational bottom, and it's the very thing that they need in order to build up. But sometimes they'll hit a bottom, and then that will be it, and that will be the demise of the relationship. So, you know, one of my passions is helping educate men, you know, that your emotions are part of your brain, right? Your emotions are not a weakness. So when you're in touch with what's going on inside, you're in touch with your neurobiology. And then you being able to convey that and communicate that to your partner is actually very masculine. You know, contrary to what our culture believes and says, it's masculine to know yourself. It's masculine to be transparent with yourself.
I think that's an amazing perspective, and I'm glad that you gave that. And I think women, if you're talking about men, women will feel so much more valued that their partner is taking that time to show that side of them. Nurturing your intimacy in any relationship, you have to make it a point to show your appreciation for one another. You have to, you know, make an effort to learn about each other, set aside time for each other, show that physical affection. And I think the communication, like we said, is key to build that intimacy and that security and trust in the relationship. Because I think that helps the foundation of getting to that point where you're at a good point for the sexual intimacy to be consistent.
Absolutely. And I love how you said that, you know, when a man is able to be vulnerable with a woman and with his partner, that helps to increase the value, right? Like that increases the value of the investment in the relationship. And I think I love how it also creates the value of how the woman sees the man, right? Which is probably the contrary to what a lot of men think and feel. But what I'm hearing you say is that when a man is able to do that to his partner, that actually increases the value.
Yes, I've definitely observed that of the woman starts to feel more confident in her partner and herself. And I mean, even from a personal standpoint, and I know that I've seen this in other clients, but you want to feel sexy. You want to feel desired. You want to feel good going into it. It's, you know, entering any vulnerable state of the physical intimacy, you just want to feel like sexy. And I don't know how guys want to feel, but when we feel sexy and confident, I think we're having all those needs met.
And the idea of confidence, right? Like confidence, and you know, I think you're speaking of confidence in a couple ways, like confidence, certainly in the sexual component, right? Like if you're feeling desired and wanted and attracted towards, right? Like that helps to facilitate that confidence. And I think men need to know that their confidence in themselves can beget confidence in their female counterparts, right? Like if they're confident in themselves and being able to say, hey, this is who I am, this is what I feel, this is my vulnerability. What I'm hearing is that can then translate to the woman feeling that sense of like value in herself, which then makes her feel more sexually attractive. And I think also makes her feel more attracted to the male counterpart and can really help create that chemistry in that moment.
Sure. I think that's very valuable input, and even more fun then couples can explore what type of intimacy they like, whether it's exploring different role-playing exercises or, just different things in the bedroom where they can share. That's, again, being vulnerable, and my partner letting me know what they like, what they want from me in that intimate state. And that brings them closer together.
Absolutely. I think it certainly does. It creates growth and creates connection. And people are different, right? So people have different attractions. There's different things that, I think will draw people closer together. But being able to do that, I think will expand the intimacy and really take it to another level.
Of course. And there's so much more to expand on this topic. And today we're kind of going to, just keep it where we're at right now and just let our listeners know that there's no right or wrong when it comes to intimacy, when it comes to your relationship, when it comes to what you need. So just do what makes you feel good, what makes you feel connected, and just have that open communication with your partner. And we're definitely going to keep exploring this topic and have more episodes about it. I don't know if you wanted to add anything else.
Yeah, one last thing, just to piggyback off what you're saying, the uniqueness of every relationship, I call it relational DNA. Just like every individual has their own unique DNA, every relationship has their own unique DNA. And that's why it's so important, and you made this point earlier, to not compare to other relationships, right? So the subjectivity of your own relationship, there's nothing like it anywhere on the planet, which is kind of cool, I think, right? And so I think that's just a really important point. But I agree. I think this is a subject matter that we can definitely extend off of in different subtopics, Dr. Jaclyn. So I'm excited about that.
I am too. This is a fun topic. Guys, thank you so much for listening and taking your time to be with us today. We will see you next time on the Counseling Podcast.
Thank you so much for joining us here today on the Counseling Podcast with Dr. Jaclyn and Dr. Stokes. Please take this time to thank yourself for putting in the work. If this episode impacted you in any way, let us know with a loving and honest review. If you have any questions or want to continue the conversation from today, you can reach out to us at thecounselingpodcast@gmail.com, and we can answer your questions right here on the show. Or you can find Dr. Jaclyn and Dr. Stokes on Instagram at DocJaclyn and at Dr.Jeremiah.Stokes.